every weekday for 15 years, James Morton ordered the same thing at Café Luna: black coffee, 2 sugar packets, unopened, and a plain croissant, unheated. He arrived at precisely 7:45 a.m., sat at table 7 by the window, and read his morning briefings while his coffee cooled to exactly the right temperature. The staff knew him as Mr. Two Sugars. He was polite, tipped well, and never deviated from his routine. Until Marina started working the morning shift. "You know," she said on her first day, setting down his usual order, "our baker just pulled the almond croissants out of the oven. They're still warm." James looked up from his papers, startled. The previous servers had stopped trying to suggest alternatives years ago. "No, thank you, just the plain one." Marina shrugged, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Tomorrow, then." James watched her walk away, realizing this was the first real conversation he'd had at Café Luna in years. Usually he just nodded and pointed at his usual table. The next morning, Marina was ready for him. "The chef's experimenting with lavender honey lattes today," she said, placing his black coffee down. "Just saying." James straightened his tie. "I don't experiment in the morning. Everyone experiments in the morning. That's why they invented the snooze button." Despite himself, James smiled. He couldn't remember the last time he'd hit snooze, or smiled before 9 a.m. Day after day, Marina presented new suggestions. Cardamom buns on Wednesday, house-made jam on Thursday, Madagascar vanilla bean coffee on Friday. Each time, James politely declined, but he found himself looking forward to hearing the day's options. He learned that Marina was working her way through culinary school, that she tested recipes on the morning staff, that her grandmother had owned a cafe in Greece where breakfast wasn't just fuel for the day, it was a celebration of being alive. "You know what I think?" she said one morning after he'd declined cinnamon-swirled bread. "I think you're not afraid of trying new things. I think you're afraid of wanting them." James stared into his cooling coffee, seeing his reflection in the dark surface. 15 years of the same order, same table, same routine. It had started after his wife passed away. She'd always been the adventurous one, trying new cafes, exotic dishes, spontaneous weekend trips. Without her, routine had felt safer. The next morning, he arrived at his usual time, but didn't immediately sit at table 7. "Okay," he said to Marina, who was already smiling. "What's today's suggestion?" "Actually," she said, "I made something special. Give me 2 minutes." She returned with a cup of coffee that smelled of orange and cardamom, and a croissant filled with fig preserves and honey. "My grandmother's recipe," she explained, "for special occasions." "What's the occasion?" "Sometimes," she said, "choosing something new is occasion enough." The coffee was nothing like his usual order. It was better. Each sip reminded him of something he'd forgotten, the joy of surprise, the pleasure of possibility. The croissant's honey dripped onto his papers, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind the mess. Over the next months, James tried everything on the menu. He moved to different tables, watching the morning light from new angles. He learned the names of the other regulars, shared Marina's test recipes, and even brought in his wife's old cookbook for Marina to try. 1 year later, exact same time, James sat at the counter instead of table 7. Marina placed a black coffee and plain croissant in front of him, his old usual. "For old time's sake," she said with a wink, "but I also made orange cardamom scones, you know, for special occasions." James smiled, pushing the plain croissant back. "I think I'll try the scone," he said. After all, choosing something new is occasion enough. Because sometimes, he had learned, the biggest changes don't come from grand gestures or dramatic decisions. Sometimes they come from simply being brave enough to try a different breakfast, to sit at a different table, to let a friendly waitress remind you that every morning is a chance to start fresh, with or without sugar. And if anyone asked why Mr. Two Sugars now tried a different coffee each week, he'd just smile and say, "Life's too short for the same breakfast forever." Then he'd raise his cup, whatever was in it that day, in a quiet toast to change, to memory, and to the simple courage of choosing something new.